Ethelbert Miller, welcome to the Baseball Bookshelf Conversations.
Thanks for the invitation.
You have the distinction of being the first poet we've had on, and I know you're connected with the Pandemic Baseball Book Club, which I first heard of your new collection of poems, When Your Wife Has Tommy John Surgery and Other Baseball Stories. One of the things I always say on the blog is that I feel very unqualified to comment on baseball fiction, knowing how hard the authors work to get their stories across. I feel even less qualified to talk about poetry. So please tell us how you came to poetry as opposed to other areas of writing.
Well, I started out when I was growing up in the South Bronx. I was playing the piano. So in terms of arts, I was doing that first. And then I guess being influenced by my father, I began to sketch and draw a little bit. So those were the things I was doing growing up in New York. It wasn't until I went south to Washington, D.C. and attended Howard University that I started writing poetry. If you go back in my high school days, the only poetry I was really following was like Bob Dylan and Paul Simon or Simon and Garfunkel. I wasn't pretty much following like Langston Hughes. I went to a junior high school named after Paul Laurence Dunbar, but nobody taught me any Dunbar poetry or Langston Hughes poetry. So it wasn't until I came to Historic Black College was I introduced to African American literature, found it very interesting, and then all of a sudden I looked up, I was writing poems and sending them back to friends and family in New York. So that's how I came to poetry that way.
I find poetry is so, it's hard for me to express it. A lot of us are used to poetry that rhymes. So poetry that doesn't rhyme throws us off a little bit, and we wonder, well, what makes this poetry? So could you please explain?
Well, it's good. I like to say that poetry, makes you work, and what happens is that you don't read poetry the way you read the newspaper. It's not like a carry-out type of thing. It sometimes requires heavy lifting. It's why many times that, when people are introduced to poetry, it is rhyme. It is like some sort of limerick or couplet or something like that. And as they move into something more difficult, where, it's philosophical or they got to reflect on it, they find it sometimes difficult, to sort of embrace. It doesn't make sense to me, But then sometimes what happens, you could read a poem. I guess is where it gets into what makes poetry different. You can read a poem, and then something happens in your life. You come back to that poem 2, 3, 5, 10 years later, and all of a sudden it connects to you. Maybe because of grief, maybe because of something joyful, but you connect to it. We find poetry is useful, for example, when it's holiday or when we fall in love, we're looking for the right card. So poetry is useful, and so we try to use it that way. When it comes to just casually reading it, it has to be something that has to be introduced to you correctly. Sometimes people get introduced to poetry because they have a teacher likes poetry and teaches it well. Some people are introduced to it because their parents read poems to them before they go to sleep. And so poetry is like a pillow for them, comforting. And so, for many people, I understand the genre is difficult. What I tell people, when you pick up a poem, look for the door or window that you can enter. It might not be the first stanza, it might be the third stanza, but some place that you might connect to a line, a word, or a stanza, and then the poem sort of makes sense to you if you walk around in that room.
I'm glad you brought that up, because when you're writing nonfiction, you're looking for facts. And when you're writing fiction, you're looking for story, and poetry in the same way. Pardon me. How much time do you spend agonizing over your choice of words? Is it something that just comes like, I think of some of your poetry, because again, I don't have a lot of experience with poetry. I think of some of these things as like a dream journal. Like if you don't get the thought out right away, you're going to forget it, and you lose the details. So what goes into the word selection?
I tell you, your question is very interesting in terms of what I'm writing now, in terms of baseball poetry, or poetry about baseball. What happened, I knew right away, I better have some editors, some people to proof my manuscript, because baseball people are exact. I can't say 315 when it was 316, and if I didn't have my friend, father reviewing my manuscript, there's a couple of names in my last book I had misspelled. Well, you can't be putting that out if your audience is going to be baseball, fans and baseball scholars or baseball players. You have to be exact. So that's something that tightened me up, improved me as a writer. I think that the last 3 books that I produced are better books than, say, what I was writing when I was in the 1970s, 1980s, that I am more concerned in terms of precision. I'm more concerned in terms of, hopefully because I'm older, I'm a better writer. But I sort of bring together today, a different approach to my writing. And also I would end on this note is that, I used to be teaching creative writing, which was a thing in terms of all of a sudden you're looking at other people's work and that makes you a better writer.
You mentioned the editing process. Aside from the spell checking of names and things like that, how does one edit poetry?
Well, you edit poetry in terms of, I won't say, let's take out that word editing, let's say revision. Okay. What happens is that that's a key part of writing. When I was teaching up at Bennington, revision was key. It was a process, and it was reimagining the poem all over again. It wasn't just editing the poem and taking out something. It was revisiting it, and looking at, for example, asking yourself, what makes this poem go? What's behind it? It's just like, for example, we were car mechanics and we take the engine apart and we put it back together. Okay, what did we learn? Okay, and that's the most difficult thing to do is a revision. And sometimes what happens is 3, 4, and 5 drafts. Look at Walt Whitman. How many times did he revise Leaves of Grass? It's an ongoing process. And I think that's something that every writer has to wrestle with and feel comfortable that when they finish that final draft, it is finished.
Do these come easily for you, or do you find you struggle, or is it, I
Oh,
imagine combination of both?
I write very fast. I write very fast. The last, I guess, several months, I've been writing maybe sometimes 2 and 3 poems a day. And so, and keep in mind, many of my poems are short poems. So they're almost like thoughts that come to me, and it's a question of whether I'm able to capture that. And I think social media has helped because like yourself, I blog a lot. I post things on Facebook, and sometimes what happens is that I'll be writing something, and then I say, "Oh, I'm going to turn this into a poem. I like this line. I like the use of this word here." And so sometimes my writing comes out of just letters to people, Facebook statements that I post. I try to interact with what's going on in the world. So there's never a loss of subject matter.
Now, I'm looking over the notes I've written here, and I'm having a hard time reading them, so bear with me a second. Uh, I have to make a confession. I do have some experience with poetry. When I was working
Yeah,
for
I knew you would confess to me today.
when I was working for a Jewish newspaper, I was the arts and features editor, and one thing I developed was a haiku each week about the Torah reading. And I
Mhm.
found that I would not spend more than 5 minutes on it because tofu, haiku. I haven't had breakfast yet. Uh, Haiku is uh, a formula, 575. So it's easy to fit the words in. And I have to admit, as soon as I found something that fit, that was pretty germane and hopefully a little bit funny, that was it. I was done. 5 minutes. That's it.
But when you look at that form should make you practice a certain degree of mindfulness for the moment. You capture that aha, and I think that's something that yeah, I've been written a number of haiku poems because I found it was very meditative. I found it very important during the pandemic, because what happens is that it was opportunity for me to sit in my backyard and sort of reconnect with nature, and get a sense of, okay, people could be, having hardships and stuff, but I'm just going to focus on, the bird that passes, looking at the cloud. So it's very helpful in terms of, everyone like yourself finding a place within your life and within your heart to write haiku.
The a previous book that you published, If God Invented Baseball, uh, correct me if I'm wrong, because it seemed to me like the book started when the author, yourself, was a younger
Mhm.
person. The stories
Right,
were of a younger person and gradually moved on through time.
right.
Is,
That's exactly what how the book is struck. You hit it on the nail. What I wanted to do was go from like childhood, playing with friends, to old timers day. And some of the poems at the end become more spiritual.
they do become more spiritual. They become a little bit, as someone who is getting to those golden years,
Later
a
inning, later
little
inning. No, not
depressing.
later innings.
And in your new book, I noticed, and I showed this to my wife, who is a jazz musician, and she was fascinated by the connections that you made with people like Ornette Coleman and Dizzy, Miles Davis and Duke Ellington. There is a connection they speak of between jazz and baseball. Can you talk about that a
Well, you
little bit?
know, if we were to Google Duke Ellington, you know, this picture, Duke Ellington was a baseball fan, you know. So now there's a photograph of him in front of his bus, you know, his musician,
Mhm.
and that his swinging that bat. I think, you know, he need a hitting instructor, but you know, for a piano player, you need anybody to help him. But what happens is that, you know, I wanted to capture this musicality in terms of the jazz and blues. But the other thing I did, and this is something that sometimes people don't focus on, but who does your blurbs? Okay, so you notice on the back of my last book, I have a blurb from Liz Lerman, you know, MacArthur winner, famous dancing choreographer. And I asked, and she's a baseball fan, but what I was thinking of was just the fact that Ozzie Smith, you know, shortstop, St. Louis, there's a certain choreography and beauty and aesthetic when you deal with baseball, you know. And so where you can think about music, you can also think of music and then ballet, you know.
Exactly.
But the other thing that I'm doing in this third book, I'm moving, and so I said in the last one, I'm moving more and more into the visual arts. You know, so I want to have the whole thing in terms of music, and then I also want to have the whole thing in terms of visual arts, so that all the arts are coming together. And it's a way, if we're saying, okay, this is the American pastime, yeah, then the American pastime should be able to reach into music, art, dance, all those forms coming together under this umbrella of baseball.
So when you put these collections together, first of all, do you write with the plan that these will come into a collection?
Well, I go back and mention, because the person who makes this all possible is my friend David Wilk, who published my poems. And this is, I'll go to social media once again. I have a tendency of publishing my first poetry book, well, my first poems. I published on Facebook. And so David Wilk, who I hadn't seen for many years, David Wilk at one time back in the 70s was head of the literature division of NEA. You know, I knew him as that, you know, but he was evidently following me on Facebook, and he said, I like these baseball poems. And then he said, do you have a collection? Because he's a publisher. And I said, I do now. You know? and I love that, you know, because he believed in the work. And all of a sudden I realized I could pull this together. And then, you know, many times I go off to a retreat like Blue Mountain Center, and I know I'm going to finish the book. Okay. And, you know, people say, okay, how do these poems come? Ron, if you just look at the table of contents, you can just go down and immediately there's a baseball term. Okay. So if you threw out as an exercise 5 things associated with baseball, I probably could quickly write a poem, whether it's a beanball, whether it's a foul ball, something. And that's how I was able to write. And then I began to move outside of just concepts of dealing with baseball to dealing with baseball history, whether it's the Negro League, whether it's somebody like Jimmy Pearsall I got in the next book. In my next book, I have a poem in the voice of Ken Griffey Sr., looking at his son, Ken Griffey Jr. And then Emmett Ashford, you know, the black umpire, he was just as important as, say, Jackie Robinson. So all these things, as I get more and more into this subject matter, I say, okay, I can look at everything around baseball, from the history of baseball to the person holding the beer as a vendor.
You mentioned holding beer as a vendor. Do you have your book in front of you?
Yeah.
I would like you to read actually the poem on page 5.
Okay, this is the hymnal, by the way, until the entire
Oh, okay.
choir will now. Okay, and this is the fine girl in a ballpark.
Hmm. Yep.
Okay, girl in the ballpark with her back to the stands. I was the best player on my block, in my neighborhood, in my school. I could run, hit, and catch. I guess it's because of catching. I'm sitting by the foul line in right field. I chase after foul balls and flip them to those boys in the stands with open gloves. People probably wonder why I'm not wearing a dress or singing in the church choir. Yeah.
And this
Now,
is why I asked you to read it, because I
mhm.
wanted to hear the words coming out of your voice. If I read it, I probably would have read it in a different
But that's the beauty of
way.
poetry. That's the beauty of poetry.
But that's why I especially like when authors narrate their own books as
Sure.
an audio version book, because they
Right.
wrote it. They know what it sounds like in their heads when they're writing it. And I enjoy it more when I hear it
Sure.
coming from them than
Right.
even the most highly acclaimed, award-winning narrator.
Sure. But right. If I'm Miles Davis, I'm not gonna play kind of blue the same way the next time. So it's always going to be different.
Uh-huh.
You might hear me one time read this, and then I read. If I had to read it again, I read it differently. Okay, so there isn't any right. You might say, okay, it's Ethelbert's poem, it's Ethelbert's voice. He claims that, but you might read it and I say, oh, I really like Ron. Let's record you. I really like that, because maybe you put an emphasis somewhere.
Right.
Maybe you stop between stanzas where I didn't stop. Maybe you read it slower. Okay, or let's take the same poem. This is between you. We are the guys. We give this poem to a young girl
Mhm.
or woman. She reads it totally different because maybe she is that girl in the ballpark. And the key thing in this poem is she's handing the ball to the boys with the gloves. you know, I mean that's my statement. And then I'm reading Tony Stone, the black woman
Mhm.
baseball player. And so I look at the fact that I'm going from this poem about baseball and women, and a woman who did play in professionally. And so I want to make sure that if I'm going to write poems about baseball, the issue of gender is addressed.
Now, another question I have is, how do you decide on the title for the poem? Because if I had read this poem without the title, if I had not
Mhm.
seen the title and I get down to the bottom, then I realize, wait a minute, this is a girl who's
Right,
talking here.
right,
That would have shocked me, but I kind of know from the headline, from the title, that this is a
right.
girl.
Sure.
So what goes
And
into
and then
the
yeah, and then there's a lot. It's just the title. It almost stands alone. Girl in the ballpark with her bat to the stands. Now, if you look at that title, and this gets back to what I was saying something earlier about me being influenced more with the visual arts. That's almost like the title of a painting. If you go into a
I was
museum, oh,
thinking
girl,
just that.
right. You see, and so that's what I wanted to do. And I would say this, Ron, one of the most difficult things I had to do as a writer, especially as a poet, was naming my children. Okay,
Wow.
that was the most challenging thing, because I was talking earlier about revision. I grew up and went through a period of time, like especially when I was in college in like the 70s, where Black people were renaming their children, right? So I had a friend of mine who named her child Rainforest, right? So I hadn't seen her in a number of years, right? I saw her on the bus, like maybe 10 years later. I said, oh, how's Rainforest? She said, Ethelbert, my son came to me one day and said, call me George. you know?
Sure,
And
sure.
I had another friend of mine, lovely friend. She named her daughter Africa. And I always used to joke with her. I said, okay, I'm the teacher. And I said, sit down, Africa. and the child gets up and says, no, I'm independent. I'm going to the bathroom. So the naming is funny, but the naming of poems is difficult. But as you can see, Ron, I tried to, like, when your wife has Tommy John surgery. It's an intriguing title. I might pick it up and say, okay, what's Tommy John surgery? Okay, and that's why I had to explain that in the book through a poem. And then the most difficult thing was figuring out, okay, what color am I going to put on the cover to interpret when your wife has Tommy John surgery? And so what you saw is these Black nurses at one of the first Black hospitals. So, and I like the fact that they're women nurses, dealing with, right, women nurses dealing with a topic that's dealing with, something medical. At one time, we were looking at pictures of actually somebody in an emergency room, but that didn't seem to work.
Hmm.
But it was challenging, and I think David Will did a good job with the covers.
What about the placement of the poems themselves within the book? The previous book, If God Invented Baseball, Created Baseball,
Right.
uh, that did follow somewhat of a chronology. When you write the poems, you're thinking of them as individual poems rather than
Right.
chapters of a book. But when it comes time to put them into a book, how much thought goes into where each poem appears relative to the others?
Very, very good question. This is one of the questions that was often come up when I was teaching at Bennington. And people were coming to the program, and one of the things, by the time they finished the program, they were moving towards having a book. Maybe when they graduated, would say. But the key thing was, okay, I have all these poems. These are poems I wrote during the program. Blah blah blah. How do I turn it into a book? How do the poems speak to each other? What is themes? And what happens? You can juxtaposition poems in such a way that they speak to each other. Okay. I started doing this when I was editing anthologies, which was a body of people's work. And I wanted to make sure that if I put this anthology together and it wasn't chronological, I wanted to have poems that interface. And I wanted to do that because many times when people pick up a book or like an anthology with many people's poems, the first thing they do is go to their poem to see if their poem is printed properly and their name is spelled correctly. And so I wanted the person to say, okay, wow, this is my poem on page 25. What's on page 24? What's on page 26? To see exactly how the poems speak to each other, because I would like people, gets back to your point of question, to read a book of poetry at sometimes the way you might read a book of fiction, prose. At the same time, you can just jump into a collection of poetry and work your way around it. But the laying out of poems in a manuscript is very difficult. It is something that, takes time. And it gets back to the field. If you're going to spend time trying to get it right in terms of what word you're going to use, you should get it right in terms of when you put your book together, when you decide on your title, or even who you're going to be dedicating the book to. All that should be something that one reflects on. And this is why many poets who self-publish don't have that luxury of standing back from what they're doing. Many times they just want to get it done quickly and pay the bill and hand out the copies. But if I agree today to accept your manuscript, I've got a year before it comes out. Okay, and I might say, let's take this poem out. This isn't working here. Let's rearrange the order. And this is where you're looking for your first responders, your first readers to help you with this task.
In this particular book, you include the pandemic, you include recent politics. So are all these poems in this particular volume more recent?
Well, they're more recent as opposed to this is a trilogy. So the next book, or the final book, comes out next year around the All-Star game, according to David Wilt. So what happens is that if I look at the 3 books, because the final volume is completed, I'm really happy with the third book, and not because it's the things I just wrote recently, but because I can see myself getting better. It's the same way, like in baseball, you come up from the minor leagues and you're throwing hard, you're striking out people. But what happened? Do you know how to pitch?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think now when I sit down and looked at this third collection I just finished, I know I'm pitching well. And that's time like Tommy John, okay, after my Tommy John surgery, wow, I'm a really good pitcher. I can make the All-Star team next year. So, that's the approach I've been taking to this body of work.
I would ask you now to read, speaking of the pandemic and how it changed baseball these past couple of years, Extra Innings on page 53.
Okay. And Extra Innings. And I had a problem with this. The problem with this extra innings and the guy on second base. The new rule places a man on second base at the beginning of the 10th inning. This is another example of privilege. If you had been born rich, you found yourself on third. How did you get there? What baseball scandal cheated you to this place? What if God wanted to speed up the game? What if you were born in your grave? What sacrifice would you have to be made in order for you to live? Why do you want to live? Is it for the love of the game or the endless desire for extra innings? And I have to give credit. There's a writer, economic expert by the name of Chuck Collins, who comes from a very wealthy family. He was, and he talks about like being born on third base, that privilege. And, I learned a lot in terms of interviewing him around economic inequality. Some people are born on third base. And so this whole thing in terms of the new rules, the extra innings, it's very important because, what happens now, it does require a manager to really manage, it does that. But then, sort of like the whole thing of having the automatic walk to first base, where you just single forward with as a manager, you're not throwing the pitcher throwing 4 pitches to the catcher, where you never knew what could happen. and I feel that, we're sort of, it's not really speeding up the game, but it does enable something that you could make a mistake. I mean, I was just watching the football game the other day, just a few days ago. Kansas City won this game. You're right. So somebody fumbled, and the Ravens won. I mean, you never know. And so when you bring it back to baseball, I like the relief pitcher strolling in from the outfield. I grew up with Luis Arroyo, helping coming in to relieve Whitey Ford, and that jacket over the shoulder, that gunslinger type of thing. If you got a jacket over your shoulder and you come in, and you throw 3 strikes, and the batter just looks at all 3, yeah, that's like going to the saloon and say, look, okay, you're not going to follow me outside, and it's not going to be a gun match because I already took your drink while I was in the bar. Okay, but that's one of the things that the speeding up, like I looked at this the person on third base. I said, well, can you imagine if you looked up and Ricky Henderson was on second in the 10th inning? He's going to steal third and the game is over. You know what I'm saying? This whole thing of bunt him over and stuff like that. I just have a problem with it. And I'm concerned about what we see happening in our society, this tinkering and this whole thing of catering to its youth. So when you go back to what you saw in my book, yeah, we begin in childhood and the book progresses. I think there is a role that elders and seniors play. You don't want to speed the game up for them. Okay, and they're called the people who hold on to the tradition. They keep the tent up. They are the pillars. And what happens is that unfortunately we've been knocking pillars down like they're monuments. That's a joke.
Now, as I mentioned earlier on, you are a member, for lack of a better word, of the Pandemic Baseball Book Club. How did you get involved with that?
Well, that's one of the things I'm probably very excited about, and which I guess it was Tim Wendell, who baseball writer, who recommended me. I love Tim Wendell, and he's our conversation's been really fun. I've interviewed him a couple of times. He's interviewed me, and I tell you that the Pandemic Baseball Club was like, wow, this is a baseball tribe, and it was really good because when you ask somebody, okay, who you're writing for, to be accepted, by other people who have a better knowledge of baseball than I have, is very, very meaningful to me. And then it comes back to how you introduced me. I feel maybe in a small way, somebody who had 10 books, on baseball, all of a sudden they'll have appreciation of poetry, or they see exactly, how something they wrote about. Here's a poem that provides a different insight into, say, a player that they were writing about or a period in time.
Do you find that, I mean, I imagine for your past books, you've been able to go out in the world and do your readings and make your appearances. It's been curtailed over the last 18 months or so because of the pandemic. Do you find that the Pandemic Baseball Book Club has helped you get the word out, has helped you financially in being able to sell more books than you might otherwise have?
Well, I tell you one thing which changed my life, and it's like a blessing. I received an email maybe about 2 months ago, from a person who said, Ethelbert, I'm a fan of your work, and it was a guy who was assistant general manager in the Nationals. And so he would say, yeah, I've been giving you a book to, he gave a book to Dusty Baker, he gave him a book to a couple of players, Doolittle when he was on the team. And so what happened is that he invited me out to, a baseball game, and actually twice this summer. And to sit next to him was really seeing the game in a new light, because he's really into the analytics and stuff. And you just begin to see exactly how baseball has changed, And so, just to have an opportunity to talk to somebody like that, somebody who felt that was very meaningful. I told him if I was Walt Whitman, that I would have had an Emerson moment, because I sent him a copy of the last book, and he got it, and I sent it to the ballpark. He said, yeah, I got it. I had my little break, and I went up into the stands, and I opened your book, put my feet up, and that was a thing. Like, I would say, can I use that as a blurb? Because it was very meaningful to me, because here was a person, whose key role in terms of, not just a player, but assistant general manager, liking the work, and liking the work to such an extent that he was giving my book away as gifts. So when I look at the Pandemic Baseball Book Club, and I look at friends of mine I'm just meeting, it's changed my life. I'm not just talking to other poets. I'm talking to people who love baseball, and I'm learning from them the same way I was learning from people when I started out as a writer.
What's the title of your next book?
How I Found Love Behind the Catcher's Mask. Yeah. So on the cover, I think David Wilk and I agree, will be a picture of Josh Gibson. So if you put the three books together, you've got Satchel Paige in the first book and Josh Gibson on the. So they're like throwing right through the Tommy John book.
Nice battery, nice bookends.
Right, nice battery, right.
We've been talking with E. Ethelbert Miller, author of the recent When Your Wife Has Tommy John Surgery and Other Baseball Stories. Highly recommend it. E. Ethelbert Miller, thank you so much for talking with us
Well,
today.
thank you. You made me think about a lot of things. So thank you very much.